Okay, I think we'll just get started. I think we've got everybody logged on now. So, hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to the second in our series of how-to webinars. Today, we are going to discuss the basics of managing your virtual server estate within License Manager. For anyone I haven't met before, my name's David Chamberlain. I've been with License Dashboard since its inception 15 years ago now as General Manager. And in addition to my everyday role, I'm also the primary contributor of functionality to the platform. So before we start, just to let everybody know, the session is being recorded and will be available to view online later on. This is just simply for the purposes of allowing users who were unable to attend today to view the webinar at their leisure, and of course for you in attendance an opportunity to go over anything that we might cover off today, and if you want to revisit that. From a housekeeping perspective, everyone has been placed on mute to eliminate any background noise, so should any questions come up during the session, please feel free to make use of the chat facility that's going to be monitored by my colleague, our marketing manager, Ben Eagling. And we're going to look to answer these queries on the fly. There will be time at the end for a QA session, and I'm going to look to complete this main demonstration and slides in about 20 minutes or so, to make sure we've got plenty of time to do that without into any more of our days. Okay, and onto the agenda. We'll start with a broad understanding of what we mean by virtualization. What does it mean to us, the very basics, before looking at why it poses one of the biggest challenges to software asset management and IT asset management. We'll then look at some of the supplemental resources available from the usage of License Dashboard Limited connectors before a demonstration of the tool in action. After that, we'll list some hints, gotchas, before finishing with the aforementioned QA session at the end. Okay, what is a virtual server? Well, a great way of maximizing the impressive processing power, greater storage and increased memory capability of today's generation of physical hardware is to partition that capacity into smaller chunks, each with its own individual operating system, dedicated resource and independent reboot provisioning. These virtual machines essentially mimic their regular traditional physical counterparts. Indeed, both of them looking pretty much the same to discovery systems, in that they both have hardware attributes and both have applications installed. Of course, this technological advance had a potential revenue impact for software vendors, where licensing had previously been per physical server. That being said, they ran the risk of missing out hugely if 4 individual SQL servers were deployed onto a single box as opposed to 4 individual physical boxes. End users expected to purchase license for the physical box instead of the 4 running instances, and of course anticipating a reduction in costs. Vendor had a different idea, so of course all licensing schemes evolved to ensure that these vendors still received their pound of flesh, that they got their full value for their IP. From a technical perspective, our downside of multiple VMs on a single box is that in the event of an overflow of virtual servers or a high degree of activity on each, it can lead to a resource hogging and ultimately performance issues. This is where the virtualization providers really up their game and introduce the concept of clustering. That is to say, joining several physical servers into single clusters and enabling the virtual machines to move freely between these servers based upon things such as resource availability. Great advances based upon administrator choice and configuration, choosing servers that can or cannot run together were introduced, affinity and anti-affinity rules, or even allowing the hypervisor layer to make that determination and move a VM on the fly based upon resource availability. Again, the issue for vendors here is that a VM running SQL server might well run on each server in that cluster, each physical box. So in the diagram here, we've got 3 physical servers. If a VM runs on each of those, that's a problem for those. So in the case of Microsoft, unless each physical server had an appropriate SQL license, the end user would be breaching the 90-day reassignment rule. This reassignment rule was essentially written in prior to virtualization to negate a potential compliance loophole regarding concurrent usage of licenses. So Microsoft was stating that licenses must be assigned to a server or can be assigned to a server but that whilst it can be transferred from one asset to another, you can't reassign it within 90 days of that first assignment. So we can see why mobility can cause additional liability. Also, the very nature of mobility, dynamic resource assignment as it's also known, or dynamic resource scheduler, introduces the potential of movement. So that word potential is very important, because whether that move occurs or not still requires licensing. So it's the same as having software installed requires you to have a license whether you use it or not. So before we get to the demo, there are some useful resources available from the hypervisor connectors. So that's the ones that License Dashboard Limited provides. So not only do we pull out the data that we need, but we also generate some additional outputs that can give you some insights into what is going on within the hypervisor. Primarily the function of the connector is to provide the relationship of guest to host, clustering of hosts, and the physical architecture of the host. So how many processes, how many cores, what's the make, the model of the host. These things aren't always captured by discovery systems out of the box, particularly for non-Wintel hypervisors. So these supplemental CSV or text files offer that additional insight that's required. And the two most important that I'd point out are the host report, which gives details about the mobility within a cluster, and then the cluster rules text file, which lists any affinity or anti-affinity rules which may override the mobility settings. So we'll just have a quick look at those. Okay, so here is an example, a very small example of a host report. So we're pulling out additional data such as the display name, the host name, operating system, etc., etc. But some of the key values here tell you whether it's powered on, whether DRS or DRA is enabled, yes or no, and the level of that automation. So these are fully automated. So this tells me that within this particular cluster, it is fully enabled for mobility within that cluster, so guests can move freely. And then opening up the text file for the cluster rules, we can see whether there is a rule type, so is it affinity or anti-affinity, whether it's enabled or not, whether it's mandatory or not. And then, affinity would be which guests can run together on which hosts, or anti-affinity would be which guests cannot run together on which hosts. You can also do things like clustering if you want to condense SQL servers so that you can restrict them to only 2 hosts within a cluster so that liability doesn't go, or you can have a rule configured where a host cannot move from, a guest cannot move from one host to another. And of course, if there is mobility and you are logging migrations, the connectors will also capture migration logs. So that will track a VM, and it will report on which guest or which host it's being moved to during its life for manual migrations. Okay, so I think it is time for the demonstration. Let's see License Manager in action. So I think a word of caution before you do any work within the virtualization workspace. I think one of the messages that we try and get across at all times is to be sure that you have all of the information, that you're getting the full picture. So before you do any virtualization work, we always say go to the notifications workspace, because if you only have partial information, then the work that you're going to perform is worthless. So one of the things that we suggest that you look at straight away is device coverage. So here we can see we've only got 90% of our assets covered. We've got 44 Active Directory only devices. So go ahead and check those. Make sure that there aren't virtual servers not being captured by the discovery system for whatever reason. It might not have a client agent. It might have been switched off when the scan was done. Of course, those need to be addressed before you do anything within virtualization. Likewise, we have another one here, and I'll refer to this later on for the QA and the gotchas. We've got a listing here of 104 virtual machines without a host. Now, of course, it's impossible to work out your virtualization position or liability for virtualization if you haven't got the host details, because quite often it's the host that needs to be licensed and not the virtual running instance. So go ahead and address these, make sure these are all fixed before you do anything within License Manager. Then the other thing is make sure you're ready with the dictionaries. So we have in the dictionaries an additional field for products that are affected by virtualization, by DRA, by mobility within a cluster. And we call that DRA applies. So Office Professional, it doesn't matter whether it's in a mobile cluster or not, you just run the running instance, not the actual maximum virtualization. But some products like Exchange, SQL Server, Windows Server, they are all affected by mobility. So it's very important that you have these checked in your dictionaries, DRA applies, and that these are going to be affected by that. So they don't come as standard because it's a growing thing and people can cleanse and do their own SRS. But it's very easy to do. You just go through the vendors that you think should be covered and products that you think should be applicable, check that particular box. Or there is also the ability to export attributes, do it within Excel and import it. It just takes a few seconds. Okay, so we are good to go. So we can now look at the virtualization area, which of course sits in the assets workspace. We go to the virtualization workspace. Now we can see here how License Manager breaks things up. So we've got a production cluster and we've got a development cluster. Production cluster is made up of 3 hosts and the development cluster of just 2. And if we look at the production cluster, we can see the physical architecture of that. So it's a Dell, it's got 2 processors, 12 cores, the operating system is VMware. And we can see the same for ESX2 and ESX3. What we can also do is look at the virtual guests that are running on each of those hosts. So ESX3 has 24 guests, ESX2 has 34, and ESX1 has 37. So it's at this point that we sort of review those outputs and make a determination as to, is there any mobility within this cluster? Can this LDQ SRV move from ESX1 to ESX2? Is there that potential? So we review our outputs and we choose to manage DRA. So we know from the outputs that there was DRA fully enabled. So we just hit update on that and the production and dev clusters. And now we've got an icon that tells us that DRA is mobile, so visually we understand that it's happening. And now we can see something dramatic has happened. So on ESX1, no longer does it have those 30 odd guests, it now has a potential of 95. And you can see here what we have is what's known as a phantom. So this is a virtual machine that's not necessarily sat on ESX1. You can see in brackets it's telling us it's sat on ESX2, but it does have the potential to run there. And that's the important thing for the vendor, that potential to run. And we mentioned that in the slides earlier before. So now if we look at guest software usage and we look at Windows Server, you can see exactly what it is that I mean. So here we've got all of these guest operating systems running on those guests, and we can see the high watermark, and it's important for us to capture that high watermark, particularly for Windows Server, because if ESX2 and ESX3 die, everything's going to ultimately move to ESX1, so we need to have sufficient licenses to cover all of those guests. So we can see the watermark, the high watermark potential. We can also see the actual number that are sat on there. So we've got 68 Windows operating systems, only 25 of them are actually on ESX1 at this moment in time. So what we're going to do is we're going to select these guest operating systems and we're going to cover them with some host usage. So I'm going to select those, I'm going to map with new, and from the dictionaries I'm going to choose the most appropriate license. So I'm going to choose Windows Server Data Center license, choose the 2-core one here, I'm going to choose the metric that needs to be measured, so it's the 2-core OS. The system for me is going to tell me how many of those I need. And when I look at my license entitlement, I can actually see how many licenses I have currently spare. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to configure a rule. I'm going to say, look, if another guest operating system Windows Server comes on board, then it's going to be covered under this particular license. I don't want to go and revisit this every single time. So I'm going to say this is going to give me unlimited Windows Server guests. And I know that it's going to be the same for ESX2 and ESX3, so I'm actually going to replicate that across the cluster. And I'm going to hit update. And you can see these reds turn to black, and they will be covered under those operating systems. So it's great that these have all been affected and everything's fixed. So now that these are black, these aren't going to demand a license. Anything that remains in red will indeed remain a license. So there's some nice features within the virtualization workspace. So for example, if you wanted to view any particular hosts within a cluster, because some people have some huge clusters and data centers, and where Windows Server isn't licensed at the host level, you can just click on that and it will show you in the tree and in the branch exactly which servers haven't been covered at the host. So it's good and easy to find throughout the system. The system is also going to provide notifications. So if you assign a host license for Windows Server 2012, for example, and try and cover a guest 2016, which shouldn't be allowed, it's going to throw out a notification that will tell you you've made an error. Also, if you were to license a host with legacy licensing, so let's say you're trying to use some Windows Enterprise 2008 or some Windows Server Standard licenses to cover a set quantity of guests, you know, if you wanted to put 10 Windows Server Standard and cover 20 guests, then of course, you know, it will tell you if you've got capacity, or it will tell you if you go over that particular limit as well. So some gotchas, and again, you know, we're always talking about complete information, not getting the full picture. So we saw in the demonstration, everything relies on that complete information. So again, what we'd want to point back is check that you have all of the assets covered, that all of the virtual machines have indeed been scanned, and that you understand what is deployed upon those. And again, importantly, make sure that any virtual machines that don't have a host have a host. It's probably an indicator that a hypervisor hasn't been scanned, but this can always be added manually, or indeed, you know, connecting to that vCenter. Again, make sure you are fully prepared before tackling the virtual estate. From a non-compliance perspective, it represents by far the greatest area of risk. In case of any doubt, always assume the worst case scenario and work forward from there. That's what the vendor does. And by following this approach, any mitigation you do discover, such as affinity or anti-affinity, become documented within the system. And your answers are there should anyone knock on the door and pose the question, why doesn't this require a license? Sit with your systems administrators, show them the findings of the tools and supplemental outputs. Challenge if DRA is always necessary in each occasion. Look at the impact of creating affinity or anti-affinity. Or within a cluster, you know, can you maybe set aside 2 or 3 physical servers for SQL alone? Do review all of the outputs from the connectors. They often show insights and can point the way to reducing your license requirement. And on a final note, if you can't find any help online or through our user guides, please do get in touch. We are here to help. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll open the floor to questions.